The air over the city had held its warmth long into the evening, the way it does in the weeks when summer has only just begun to loosen its grip. A heaviness that settled between the buildings and pressed gently against the skin, carrying with it the accumulated breath of the day. Bread that had cooled hours ago, animals that had passed through and were long gone, stone that had drunk sunlight since morning and was only now, very slowly, beginning to release it. The Subura occupied a long bowl of ground between the hills, a district of stacked and crowded apartment buildings that rose 4 and 5 stories against the pale sky, their upper floors jutting slightly outward on wooden brackets so that neighbours across the narrow street might almost reach one another across the gap. It was one of the densest parts of the city, and one of the noisiest during the day. When vendors worked the ground floor spaces and carts moved through the streets and the whole district produced a continuous layered sound that was almost geological in its constancy. But the day had been winding down for some time now, the carts mostly gone by the hour before dusk. Heavy wagons were not permitted inside the city during daylight, and the streets had grown quieter as the afternoon wore on, the vendors packing what remained of their goods, the last conversations thinning out as people moved indoors. The first drops arrived without announcement, the way the first drops almost always do, individually and far apart, so that for a long moment it was possible to believe nothing was beginning. One darkened a roof tile near the ridge of a building on the higher side of the Subura, a tile the colour of dried clay, a colour that had been the same since the building went up a generation before. The drops spread outward from its point of contact, a widening circle going from pale to deep rust. Orange, and then another fell nearby, and another on the tile beside it. And in the space of a few slow breaths, the ridge of the roof had gone dark in an uneven patchwork, wet and dry, alternating, the wet patches growing and beginning to reach toward one another. Down in the street below, the stone was still warm underfoot, and the first drops that reached it simply vanished, drawn immediately into the heat of the surface, leaving no trace except a briefly darker point that faded almost before it could be seen. The smell that came up from the stone in those first moments was particular to this. Rain on warm city stone. A smell that was mineral and faintly sweet, something released from deep in the rock by the sudden contrast of cool water and stored heat. It moved through the lower air of the street, mixing with what was already there, the iron and salt smell of the drain channels that ran along the edges of the road, the residue of the day's cooking that had drifted from windows and courtyards and now hung in the still air, the faint animal smell that no amount of ordinary wind ever quite managed to clear from a street. This well travelled. The buildings of the Subura were built close enough together that rain rarely fell straight down into the streets at their narrowest points. It came in at an angle, following whatever wind existed, and in the absence of wind it dripped from the overhanging upper floors in small but steady streams that had worn pale channels into the stone of the street over years of the same. Those channels were beginning to fill now, thin lines of water gathering at the base of the walls, finding their way to the drain channel, and then along it, moving with a patience that had no particular urgency, toward the larger drains beneath. The city had been managing its water this way for a very long time. Beneath the streets of the Subura, and beneath almost every other district, there ran a vast and ancient system of covered channels. The great drain that had been extended and improved over centuries, originally built, so the old accounts said, when the low ground between the hills was still marshy and needed to be made livable. By this point in the city's long life, the system was enormous, large enough in its main channels that a person could walk upright through sections of it, and it handled not only rainwater but the continuous flow from the fountains and public basins that the aqueducts fed throughout the day and night. The aqueducts themselves came into the city on tall arched bridges from distant hills and springs, and once inside they branched and narrowed, their water descending through pipes of lead and clay to the fountains that stood at street corners throughout every district. That water never stopped moving. It ran through the city at all hours, in the walls and under the streets, a slow and constant presence beneath everything else. The rain was steady now, not heavy, but committed, the kind that settles in for the night. The terracotta rooftops of the Subura had gone uniformly dark, the dry patches fully absorbed, and water was running in thin, bright sheets down the pitched surfaces toward the gutters at their edges, where it gathered and fell in small curtains over the sides of the buildings, catching what little remained of the light. The sky above had moved through its colours and arrived at a deep grey blue that held no particular distinction between cloud and sky, just an even, featureless ceiling from which the rain came down in its quiet, continuous way. At the windows of the upper floors, in the apartments where families had already drawn themselves inward for the evening, small lights were beginning to appear. Oil lamps set on ledges or hung from hooks, their flames enclosed and steady, throwing a warm and limited orange light that reached perhaps an arm's length in every direction and no further. From the street, these windows were gentle presences, each one a small, warm signal that the building was inhabited, that inside the cold and wet there were rooms and people and the ordinary ongoing life of the evening. The lamps burned olive oil, and the smell of it, faintly nutty and slightly acrid, drifted with the cooking smells from the windows of the lower floors, threading through the wet air and the smell of rain, washed stone into something that was simply the smell of the Subura at nightfall. Unremarkable to anyone who lived there, and complete. The rain fell on. The stone grew darker, and then could grow no darker. The last of the day's heat moved up from the street in a thin wavering layer, visible for a moment in the lamplight from a window, and then it was gone, and the warmth that remained was only the warmth still locked inside the stone and the brick and the tile, radiating outward very slowly into the cooling air, a warmth that would take most of the night to fully release. The city was settling into the first deep hours of its quiet, the sounds of the day almost entirely gone now, replaced by the sound of water. Water on tile, water on stone, water in the drains, water running somewhere beneath the street in the dark, moving always and without hurry toward the river. The buildings that lined the narrow streets were rarely fewer than 3 stories, and in some of the denser quarters they rose to 5 or 6, their upper floors leaning slightly toward one another across the gap of the alley until the strip of sky above was barely wider than a man's outstretched arms. From the outside, at this hour, these great stacked structures were dark masses relieved only by the scattered orange-yellow flicker of oil lamps set on window ledges or hung from brackets just inside open shutters, each one a small point of warmth in the general dark, the way distant fires look from a high place. Individual, trembling, improbably tender against the size of everything around them. Inside, the lamp was the centre of everything. A shallow dish of fired clay, perhaps the size of a palm, filled with low-grade olive oil pressed from the dregs of the harvest, bitter, faintly acrid, the kind that burned with a faint smoky edge to it, not unpleasant, just present. A smell that by now no one in the room consciously noticed, any more than they noticed the smell of the wool blankets folded on the sleeping bench, or the particular dense smell of plaster that had been rained on many times over the years, and had dried in many times over the years, and had dried and been rained on again. The wick was a twist of linen or flax fibre that drew the oil upward and held a flame about the size of a thumbnail, steady enough in still air, trembling whenever a draught moved through the cracks around the shutters. The light it gave was warm but limited, falling in a rough circle that might reach the far wall of a small room and no further, leaving the corners in a dimness that was not quite darkness and not quite light. In a room on the 3rd floor of one of the taller buildings, a woman had set her lamp on the ledge of the inner windowsill, the one that looked not out onto the street, but into the open courtyard at the building's centre, a shaft of open air that served the whole building as a light well, where voices and smells from every floor mingled and descended. The lamp there would not blow out so easily. Her children had been asleep for some time already, 2 of them together on a sleeping bench along the shorter wall, covered with a length of coarse wool, their breathing slow and even and out of phase with each other in the way that sleeping children's breath tends to be. One drawing in as the other released, as though they were sharing the air between them in careful turns. She had eaten earlier, lentils cooked with a little oil and dried herbs, the smell of it still faintly in the room, not unpleasant, warm, the smell of something that had been tended to. Across the courtyard, on the same floor of the adjacent wing, another lamp burned, and occasionally the woman could see the shape of it, or the shadow that moved across it, though she could not make out who was there. The intimacy of these buildings was strange and layered. Neighbours, close enough to hear one another's coughs and arguments and the particular sounds of sleep, and yet separated by enough stone and timber that each room was its own world, sealed off by walls that conducted sound in unpredictable ways, muffling some things entirely and carrying others with strange clarity. Below, on the second floor, a man had not yet put out his lamp. He worked in leather, repairing sandals and harnesses, and he had a small piece of work he had promised and not finished, and so he sat in the orange circle of light with a length of strap across his knee, his hands moving slowly, the smell of cut leather mixing with the lamp oil, and the faint brine of rain that came in under the shutters. His movements were unhurried, almost mechanical in the way that familiar handwork becomes after long repetition. The body doing what it knows while the mind sits somewhere quieter and more still. Outside, the rain fell against the shutters in irregular bursts, heavier for a moment and then soft again, and he did not look up when it changed. The stairwells of these buildings were something else entirely. They rose between the floors in tight turnings of stone or heavy timber, wide enough for one person to pass comfortably or two people to pass one another with some care, and at night they held no light at all. The lamps belonged to the rooms, the stairwells were their own dark, a deep and close dark that smelled of the building's whole accumulated life. Damp plaster, old oil, the faint residue of every meal ever cooked on every floor, stone worn smooth in the centre of each step from years of feet. A person descending in the night moved by memory and by touch, one hand trailing the wall, counting the turnings, knowing where the uneven step was and where the ceiling came down lower than expected. The dark there was not frightening, only absolute, a darkness that had always been there and would be there regardless of what happened in the lit rooms above and below. On the uppermost floor, where the roof was close and the rain the loudest, a family of 4 slept in 2 rooms separated by a curtain of heavy cloth. The rain on the tiles just above them was a continuous presence, not a sound exactly, but a texture of sound. The way a river heard from inside a tent becomes part of the air itself, rather than a thing arriving from outside. The tiles were terracotta, thick and overlapping, and they shed the water down in long channeled runs that dripped from the eaves into the alley below, and the sound of that dripping was different from the sound of the rain itself. More rhythmic, more deliberate, a secondary music made by the architecture translating weather into pattern. The smallest of the family, a child of perhaps 3 or 4 winters, had turned in her sleep so that her feet pressed against her mother's side, seeking warmth in the animal way that very young children seek it. Without intention, without waking, simply moving toward what the body knows it needs. The mother did not stir. The rain continued. The lamp in the corner had burned low, the oil nearly gone, and the flame had shrunk to a thin, wavering thread that gave almost no light at all now, only the idea of light, a faint warmth where it had been. In this way, room by room and floor by floor, the city's people had folded themselves into sleep and near sleep, and the particular half-waking that belongs to the middle of the night, when the body has rested enough to release its tension and the mind has not yet begun to move toward morning. The rain was their roof and their sound and their reason to stay still, and the stone and brick of the walls held the heat of the day in a slow release, and the lamps that still burned lower, and the ones that had been put out left only their smell behind, faint and familiar, dissolving into the dark. The Watchman had been walking this district for long enough that the route had ceased to require thought, and on a night like this one it required even less. The rain having simplified the streets, emptied them of everything that usually gave them texture and friction, so that what remained was only stone and water and the sound of his own sandals, and occasionally the sound of water finding its way down a wall or through a gap in the roofing tiles of a ground floor stall, a thin persistent sound that followed him for a few steps, and then persistent sound that followed him for a few steps, and then fell away. His name was unremarkable, and his position was modest, one of a small organized corps that the city had established some generations earlier to patrol the districts at night, watching primarily for fire. The one disaster that the crowded, wooden-floored, oil lamp-burning city truly feared above most others. And beyond that, for whatever disturbance might call for a calm hand and a steady voice. Tonight, there was none of that. Tonight, there was only the wet city going about the business of sleep, and the Watchman was its only moving part in this particular stretch of streets, the only figure breaking the long grammar of stillness. He wore a heavy woolen cloak that had been damp since the early hours of the evening and was now soaked past the point where it could hold any more water, and it hung from his shoulders with a considerable weight, and where it met the back of his neck, it was cold, and where it covered his back and chest, it was at least warm from his own body, a closed system of warmth and wet that he had long since stopped noticing. The smell of wet wool was simply the smell of being himself at this hour, mixed with the smell of the streets after rain, which was cleaner than the streets by day, the rain having diluted and moved along whatever the day had deposited in the gutters and the gaps between stones, but not without its own character, a mineral smell of wet stone and old mortar, and underneath it something darker and more organic that the city could never quite wash entirely away. The residue of 1,000,000 small daily the residue of 1,000,000 small daily activities compressed into the ground. He moved through a narrow passage between two insulae and emerged into a slightly wider street where one of the upper floor windows was still burning with lamplight, amber and faint, and the rain made the light shift slightly, as though the flame behind the oiled parchment cover were breathing, and the shadow of the window's edge fell across the stone of the building opposite and moved slowly as the Watchman moved, preceding him by a few steps and then falling behind, a soft, shapeless shadow with no urgency to it. A soft, shapeless shadow with no urgency to it at all. Higher up on the same building, another window was dark, and another, and the building rose 3 floors and then was lost in the darker dark of the rainy sky, its top invisible from where he walked. At the corner of this street, and another, narrower one, a drain had been set into the curb, and the water flowing along the gutter had collected there and was disappearing with a low, continuous sound, the kind of sound that the ear accepts and then ceases to register, and the Watchman stood near it for a moment without particular intention, only because the corner was a natural place to pause and look both ways before choosing to continue. The streets in both directions were empty. A cat sat in a recessed doorway some distance along the narrower passage, entirely dry, watching the rain with the complete indifference that cats extend toward all weather and toward Watchmen equally. The Watchman noted the cat, and the cat noted him, and neither adjusted their behavior. He had, over the years, developed the particular alertness of night work, which was not the sharp alertness of anticipation, but something more continuous and less pointed. A general openness to information, a kind of ambient attention that processed smells and sounds and the quality of light without seizing on any of them, so that if something changed, he would know it. But in the absence of change, he moved through the world as through water, touching everything lightly and disturbing nothing. The rain came down at an angle now, shifted by some movement of the air higher up, and it hit the stones at a slant and the walls at a slant, and under the overhang of a warehouse portico. The Watchman walked for a time in relative dryness, his sandals still loud on the wet stone, stepping over a puddle that had collected where the paving had settled unevenly over years, and the water had found the low point and made it a small lake, permanent enough by now to have its own character, to be a landmark. A dog somewhere inside a ground floor space made a low sound, not a bark, more of a considering sound, the sound of a dog processing the approach of footsteps and deciding they were familiar enough, or at least familiar shaped, the shape of a human being walking slowly, which dogs apparently categorize differently from the shapes of human beings walking with purpose or urgency, as though pace itself carries information about intent. The sound stopped before the Watchman had finished passing the doorway. He had a small oil lamp of his own, enclosed in a clay container with holes worked into the sides to let the light escape in thin rays, and it hung from his belt and swung gently as he walked, and it was less useful for seeing than the windows above him, since it threw its light down toward his feet and illuminated a circle of wet stone roughly the size of the space between his boots. But it was warm against his hip, and it meant something in terms of visibility. To anyone who might be watching, meant that he was there, moving, that the district was attended to. He had refilled it at the beginning of his shift from a clay jar of oil kept at a small station near the district's edge, and it would last him until the shift was over, or nearly so, which was all that was required. He turned a corner, and the smell changed, briefly, to something animal and clothes. A few goats or donkeys stabled in a small yard between buildings, invisible behind a wooden gate, their presence announced only by smell and the occasional small shuffling sound of an animal rearranging itself in sleep, hooves on packed earth, a breath released. Then that corner was behind him, and the street opened marginally, and the smell dissolved back into rain and stone. Further along this stretch, where two buildings leaned close enough together that their upper stories nearly touched, and the rain fell in a narrowed curtain between them, the stonework underfoot was older than the rest, worn smooth in a way that spoke of tremendous age, of generations of feet having crossed this same ground before any living person could account for, the mortar between the stones long since replaced and replaced again. But the stones themselves unchanged, grey and patient and slightly rounded at their edges where the passage of time had softened what was once sharp. The Watchman's sandals moved over them as they moved over everything else, without comment, and the stones received him and let him pass as they had received, and let pass everyone before him, indifferently, with the deep impassivity of things that have simply outlasted all the attention paid to them. The circuit continued. It had a shape that was neither circular nor square, but something irregular, following the logic of the district streets, which had grown without planning over a very long time and conformed to the accidents of old property lines and older roads and the paths that had existed before the roads. He knew when he was at the midpoint of the round, not by any landmark, but by a feeling, by the accumulated weight of streets walked and streets still to walk, a bodily knowledge of where he was in the night's work. He was somewhere past the middle now. The rain came down and the stones gave back the sound of it, and the walls held their warmth and their silence, and the watchman moved through it all at an even pace, unhurried, generating nothing more than footsteps and the faint tiny light swinging at his hip. And the city accepted this, as it accepted the rain, as one more thing happening in the darkness that required no response. The street he was on opened, eventually, as several streets in that part of the city did if a person followed them long enough in that direction, onto something wider, and then onto something wider still, the buildings falling back, the sky reappearing overhead, the rain suddenly audible again in its full register because there was no longer a canyon of walls to swallow it. The forum opened before him, the way a held breath releases, all at once and without drama, the space simply present where the street had been. At this hour it was not a place anyone would recognize from the daytime version of itself. In the day, the forum was pressure and sound, and the constant movement of bodies, merchants and senators, and people with petitions and people without purpose, all of them occupying every square foot of it with something: argument, transaction, ceremony, passage. The columns of the temples were backdrops for conversation. The paved floor was a surface to cross quickly. The whole vast space was organized entirely around the human activity happening inside it, the way a vessel takes its meaning from what it carries. But the rain had removed all of that, and what remained was something much older and more patient, as though the stone had been waiting for the people to leave so that it could return to being stone. The watchman moved to the edge of it and stopped. He did not stop because anything was wrong or because anything required his attention. He stopped the way water pauses in a wide place before it finds the next channel, for no reason except that the space invited it. He stood at the margin where the narrow street gave onto the broad paved floor, and he looked out across it, and the lamp at his hip swung once and then steadied. The rain was falling straight down now, no wind to angle it, and on the marble of the great paved floor it lay in long, shallow pools that caught the sky's faint grey and held it perfectly still. The surface was not a mirror in any dramatic sense. There was not enough light for that. But it was reflective in the quieter way of dark water, giving back a softened, inverted version of whatever was above it, the columns of the temples appearing to continue downward into the stone, the low clouds reproduced underfoot. The whole space doubled in a way that made it seem, at that hour, not larger exactly, but deeper, as though the forum extended not just outward, but also in some undefinable direction that had nothing to do with geography. The temples stood where they had always stood, their columns pale and wet, the stone so old in some cases that it had been worn smooth by generations of hands that had passed close to it, by air, by rain like this, rain, by the slow patient work of time on everything it touches. The roof lines were clean against the sky. The pediments, the triangular faces at the tops of the temples, filled in some cases with carved figures that in daylight told the stories of gods and founding events, were at this hour simply shapes, the carvings absorbed into shadow and the surfaces given over to water. A thin curtain of rain came off the edge of one temple roof in an almost continuous sheet, falling without pause into the pool below it, sending out soft rings that widened and faded and were replaced. The columns, in the daylight, read as architecture, as intention made physical, as the evidence of a city that had decided what it meant and built accordingly. At this hour, they were something closer to natural forms, like stone that had been this shape for as long as stone had been anything, standing in their rows with the unhurried posture of trees or cliffs or formations at the edge of the sea that no one had named. The rain ran down the grooves carved into their surfaces, the way rain runs down bark. The Watchman was not a contemplative person, in the sense that contemplation was not his work, and he did not seek it out. But he was a person who spent most of his working hours alone in the dark, in the company of a city that was mostly asleep, and a certain quality of attention had developed in him over time that was not quite thought and not quite the absence of thought, more like a steady background attentiveness that allowed him to be present to whatever was in front of him without necessarily doing anything about it. The forum at this hour was simply in front of him, and he was present to it, and that was sufficient. The great open floor, seen from where he stood, seemed to breathe slightly with the rain, the surface of the pooled water moving in the faintest pattern of rings and ripples, a constant gentle disturbance that gave the whole space a quality of slow life, as though the stone itself were breathing at a rate so unhurried that it took a long time to see it. The stone underfoot was pale travertine, a dense, creamy limestone laid flat and worn smooth. In the main expanse, with older sections of darker tuff, the compressed volcanic stone the city had long built upon, visible at the margins and in the repaired places where centuries had asked for patching. The forum, a patchwork of different materials and different centuries, all of it laid flush and worn to a common smoothness by the feet of the city over many generations. Water moved off the paved surface and toward the drains set at intervals across it, and from there it joined the water already moving beneath the city in the channels and tunnels that carried waste and runoff toward the river. A vast, slow system of stone pipes and arched passages that had been built and extended and repaired over so many years that no single person could have said with confidence where all of it went or what all of it connected. The rain that fell on the forum now would be under the city, and then in the river before the sun rose, joining the other water, losing its particular origin, becoming simply water again. The same water the city had always moved and used and moved again in its long patient cycle. Somewhere near the center of the open floor, where several of the drain channels converged beneath the stone, the water gathered before it descended, and the surface above that place was always slightly restless, always slightly more disturbed than the surrounding pools. The rings from each arriving drop overlapping the rings from the last in a continuous slow interference. The patterns too complex to follow individually and so resolving, when seen as a whole, into something that simply looked like motion. Like the floor breathing, like the forum acknowledging the rain in the only way stone knows how, which is to receive it without complaint and let it pass through. The Watchman stood for a while longer, and then moved, stepping out onto the edge of the forum's paved floor as his route required, walking along the margin of it rather than across, his sandals making a slightly different sound on the wide open stone than they had made in the narrow streets, the sound dispersing now into open air rather than being sent back by close walls. The lamp at his hip lit a small circle around him and nothing more. The columns of the nearest temple passed on his left as he walked, each one moving through the edge of his lamplight and out again into the dark. And the rain continued to fall on the wide floor, and the wide floor continued to receive it, and the pools continued to hold their inverted version of the grey sky overhead, and the whole space remained exactly what it was, neither waiting for morning nor resisting it, simply present in the night in the way that large stone things are present, with a patience that has no particular interest in being recognized as patience, that simply is, the way the rain simply is, falling on everything, asking nothing, receiving. He reached the far end of his passage along the forum's edge, and the street closed back in around him. The buildings returning, the sky disappearing overhead, the sound of rain compressing again into the familiar narrow register of walls and stone, and the small percussion of gutters. The forum was behind him now, doing whatever the forum did in the dark, which was nothing and everything, which was simply being what it had always been, patient and vast and very still. The streets narrowed and then narrowed again, the way streets in the lower quarters always did, pressing close until the eaves of buildings on opposite sides nearly touched overhead, leaving only a thin corridor of dark sky above, the rain falling through it in a fine and nearly vertical curtain. Somewhere in this part of the city, tucked against the base of a hill where the ground held heat better than open plazas did, one of the great bathhouses sat closed and dark, its massive outer walls sweating gently into the wet air. The doors were shut, the torches long unlit, and from the street it was simply a wall. A long, high, featureless expanse of brick that told nothing of what lay behind it. But the building had been warm all day, filled with the bodies of hundreds and with the slow combustion of the furnace systems that ran beneath its floors. And warmth like that does not leave quickly. It moved outward through the brick in a long, patient exhale, and where it met the rain-cooled air of the street, a thin vapour rose. Not dramatically, not in great billowing clouds, but gently, in wisps that lifted from iron drain grates set flush with the pavement, and from the narrow gaps where pipes disappeared into the wall's base. The smell near the building was particular. Warm stone and sulphur, and the mineral residue of the water that had moved through it all day. That mineral sharpness that clung to everything the water touched, which was everything, which was the whole interior world of pipes and pools and channels through which the city's water endlessly moved. The bathhouse would be cold by morning, or at least less warm, but for now it continued to release what it had stored, indifferent to the hour, following only the slow logic of heat-seeking equilibrium with whatever was around it. A cat sat on the wide lip of the drain grate nearby, its eyes half closed, absorbing what warmth still rose through the iron. It did not move as the night deepened around it. From there the ground sloped, gently but perceptibly, in the way that the ground in Rome always eventually sloped toward the river, the whole city tilting almost imperceptibly westward through its hills and valleys until it arrived at the bank of the Tiber. The Tiber ran wide and brown and higher than usual tonight, swollen by the rain that had fallen, not just here, but in the hills to the north and east, in the long watershed that the river gathered before it reached the city. The surface of the water was pocked everywhere by falling drops, textured and restless, and it moved with the particular heaviness of a river carrying more than its ordinary weight, carrying hillside soil and the leavings of fields and the small debris of 100 smaller streams that had fed into it since morning. The barges tied along the bank sat low in the water, their hulls dark and broad, the ropes that held them running at shallower angles than usual, because the river's surface had risen toward the level of the dock rather than sitting below it. They were laden, most of them. Grain, mostly, and amphorae packed in straw, and timber from the forests further inland, and they rocked very slowly in the current's pull, a motion so gradual it was almost indistinguishable from stillness. The men who worked them were sleeping somewhere nearby, in riverside rooms or under awnings stretched across the back decks, and the barges moved without them, in that slow rocking, tethered and patient, waiting for morning and the men and the unloading that would follow. The river smell was strong here, the cold mineral smell of moving water, the darker smell of silt and the organic richness of a river that had been receiving the city's drainage for centuries and had found its own accommodation with that. It was not unpleasant exactly, it was simply the smell of the Tiber at night, the smell that the people who lived near the bank had known all their lives and registered no longer as a smell, but simply as a quality of the air in this part of the city, a kind of signature that meant the river, that meant this place and no other. Beneath the bank, beneath the road that ran along the river, beneath the city itself extending back into the hills, the drainage system moved. The main channel, the great drain that the city had built and extended and rebuilt over centuries, a structure so large that a flat-bottomed boat could be rowed through its interior, ran parallel to the Tiber and discharged into it, and through it ran the continuous accumulation of everything that water carried away from streets and floors and fountains and the floors of the bathhouses themselves. It was not romantic, this infrastructure, but it was vast and it was real, and it was, in its way, as much a part of Rome as anything that stood above ground, perhaps more so, because it was older than most of what stood above and had outlasted more of the city's history than the things that could be seen. The aqueducts, too, moved through the night without pause. They had been moving continuously for as long as anyone then living could remember, and before that, and before that. The water that entered the city through the great raised channels, those long stone bridges stepping across the countryside on their rhythmic arches, arrived in collecting basins at the city's edge, and from there distributed itself through pipes of lead and fired clay of varying thickness down through every district, to the public fountains that overflowed continuously into their basins, to the bathhouses, to the private homes of those wealthy enough to have arranged a connection. The overflow from every fountain fed the streets, and then the drains, and then the river, so that the water was always moving, always descending, from the hills outside the city, through every level of the city's life, and finally out into the Tiber and southward toward the sea. Tonight the rain had added itself to this system, running off the roof tiles into the gutters, down the gutters into the street channels, into the drains, joining the water that was already moving underground, so that the whole city was threaded through with a single slow current that connected the rain still falling on the highest rooftops to the silt-heavy river moving 40 feet below at the bottom of the bank. It was one system, not many. The rain on the terracotta, and the water in the great buried drain, and the river carrying it all away, were the same water, at different stages of the same unhurried journey. And the city existed within that journey, the way a stone exists within a stream, shaped by the water over long time, unaware of being shaped, simply there. The Tiber moved on. The barges shifted in their ropes. The vapour rose from the cooling bathhouse in wisps that the night air absorbed almost immediately, leaving no record of their having been there at all. Somewhere in the lower streets, a door opened and closed without sound, reaching very far. It was the kind of movement that happened without announcement in the last deep hours of the night. A baker or a baker's apprentice letting himself into a ground-floor workspace where the oven had already been banked the evening before and only needed feeding, the coals still holding a dull orange pulse beneath their ash. The way certain things hold warmth long after the source of that warmth has gone. The wood that was carried in and laid against those coals was dry and had been kept dry, stacked against an interior wall through the evening's rain, and it caught without much ceremony, the fire building in the dark of the oven chamber, the way fire always builds, quietly at first and then with more confidence, the temperature rising in a space that had no window and needed none. The smell of wood smoke came first, as it always does. It moved through the gaps around the oven door and into the low room, and then out, through whatever small opening gave the space its air, rising into the street in a thin thread that the remaining mist softened before it climbed very high. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of something beginning, though beginning was perhaps too active a word for what was happening in those streets, where beginning and continuing and almost ending were all wound together so closely that none of them stood apart from the others. The rain had become, by now, barely weather. It was mist in the truest sense, the kind of fine, suspended water that settles on surfaces more than it falls, that accumulates on the rim of a ceramic jar or the curve of a roof tile without any sound at all, each droplet arriving too small to announce itself. The stones of the street were still wet, and would remain wet until the sun had been up for some time, and the gutters still carried a thin moving thread of water toward the drains. But the rain as a presence, as a thing happening to the city from above, had receded into something more like memory than event. In the bakeries, and there were many of them scattered through the neighbourhoods, since the city had long depended on bread made by those who spent their lives making bread, the flour milled and the loaves shaped by hands that had done only this for years. The work went on with a particular calm of work, so familiar it no longer requires full attention. Dough that had been resting was brought out, pressed and shaped on stone surfaces worn smooth by long use, formed into rounds that would sit and rest again before the oven was ready to receive them. Everything happened in order and at its own pace. Nothing was hurried. The night outside was very quiet, and the work inside was very quiet, and there was no friction between them. The smell of the woodsmoke had by now moved further into the surrounding streets, mixing with the damp stone smell and the faint mineral smell of the mist, and the combination was gentle in the way that only very early morning can be gentle, before the city's ordinary noise reassembles itself. An hour or more would pass before the first loaves came out of the first ovens, before the smell of warm-baked grain began to layer itself over the smoke. But the smoke alone was already doing something to the air, warming it slightly in the very immediate vicinity of the bakery doors, marking those corners of the city as places where the cold was beginning to give a little. The insulae above those street-level spaces still held their sleeping residents, the oil lamps extinguished hours ago, the families and the solitary tenants and the old women and the children, all somewhere in the particular stillness of deep sleep, the kind of sleep that comes in the last hours of darkness when the body is furthest from waking. The stairwells were completely dark. The narrow courtyards held a shallow puddle here and there where water had collected in a depression of the paving, each one holding a faint reflection of whatever grey-blue light the sky was barely beginning to give off, though dawn was still some distance away, and what light existed was more an easing of darkness than anything yet describable as light. The forum, far from the bakeries in space, if not in the shared quiet of that hour, was still and still wet, its marble surfaces holding their thin mirrors of water. Nothing moved across it. The columns stood in the same arrangement they had always stood, and the wide paved floor was as empty as it had been for hours, and would remain so for a while yet. The night watchman had long since completed one of his circuits, and moved on through the dark streets beyond, and the city had no other business with itself that required anyone to be abroad. The forum simply existed in the dark and the damp, as it had, and as it would, patient in the way that stone is patient, which is to say not patient at all, but simply indifferent to time in a way that from a distance resembles patience. Down at the river, the barges sat in their ropes without moving much. The Tiber was still high and still carrying its burden of silt and whatever the rain had delivered into it from the streets and the drains, moving in the dark toward the sea, with no awareness of moving, the water at the surface and the water below it, all going the same direction at the same pace, the whole river, a single, slow fact proceeding through the sleeping city. The ropes that held the barges creaked very softly now and then, a sound that carried almost no distance in the wet air. Along the near bank, where the larger vessels had been tied up since the previous afternoon, the water moved in slow, folding shapes against the whole wood, each fold rising and flattening without urgency, the river conducting its own business entirely apart from the city it ran through, unbothered by the bakeries and the sleeping families and the empty forum, carrying its cold, dark water past all of it with the same even indifference it had carried everything else downstream across all the years before. And in the bakeries, the ovens had reached their heat. The first rounds of dough were slid in on long, flat paddles. The oven doors closed again, and the waiting began, which was no different from the rest of the night and no different from the work itself. All of it a form of waiting, patient and unhurried, the way grain becomes flour and flour becomes dough, and dough becomes bread, through nothing more than time applied in the right order. The warmth from the ovens moved through the walls and into the floor, and the floor gave a little of it back to the street above. Not enough to notice, not enough to measure, but present. The mist was thinning. Not dramatically, not in a way that marked a moment, but in the way that mist always thins when the air shifts very slightly towards something drier, so gradually that no single instant could be pointed to as the change. The puddles in the courtyard still reflected their grey light. The gutters still moved their thread of water. The city was still night. But something in the quality of the dark had changed. Some faint signal, too subtle for any person awake to name with certainty, the way the body sometimes knows. It is almost morning long before the eyes can confirm it. The bread was baking in the dark beneath the sleeping city. The water was receding very slowly into stone and sky. The warmth was returning underground, through the heated chambers and the channels and the deep, slow mass of the earth beneath the streets. The smoke from the ovens continued to rise, invisible now against the dark air, carrying its particular message of warmth and grain and ordinary human work into a city that would not know for hours yet that it was almost ready to be woken. For now there was only the last of the quiet, settling over everything the way water settles, finding every low place, filling every stillness, resting there without effort or intent, simply present in the way that all things rest when nothing is asking them to be otherwise.